Welcome, everyone. This video is the beginning of a series of discussions with my good friend, Charles Stang. Charles is a professor at Harvard and the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions. I first encountered Charles, not in person, but via his excellent book, The Divine Double. I read the book and became very interested in his work, and then I happened to meet him at a symposium to which I was invited about the subtle body, and he and I had hit it off, and we have had an ongoing relationship. We meet at conferences, symposia, and I just value his work, and I value the relationship I have with him. What we're doing in this series is we're talking about, even calling it an entity is a bit of what the series is about. We're talking about, I'll use this term, this entity, that is emerging in things like IFS, internal family systems theory, or ally work, Raff's work, or other work that people are doing, where people are encountering these semi-autonomous entities. And this overlaps with John Geiger's work on the third man factor and Anderson Day's work on the people's sense of presence. All of this, and there's so much good cog-sci emerging around this. What are these? Are they just inner aspects of the person's personality? Are they external, metaphysically autonomous beings? I think both of those are wrong. I think they're inherently transjective entities that are presencing in an imaginally powerful way, deep ways in which the depths of our psyche, the archetypal depths perhaps of our psyche, are connected to prototypical Platonic formal aspects of reality in ways that are powerfully affording of transformation, but also carry with them tremendous risk of things going awry, people dropping into rabbit holes, exacerbating patterns of self-deceptive self-destruction. And we're going to wrestle with all of that. Now, I bring all of that cog-sci to bear. What does Charles bring? He brings his brilliant scholarship and reflection that he draws from the ancient world. He's going to talk specifically, initially, for example, in this video, we start to talk about Socrates' Daimon, or actually more often his Daimonium, the divine sign, the voice he heard. Is it just his conscience? What is it? What's going on? How did it work? What does this mean? How does this line up with other things that we're now talking about very seriously and in a rigorous way, a scholastically rigorous way? And then we'll go on and then we talk about the same thing from the viewpoint of Aristophanes, and so on. And Charles has gone through the ancient literature, because the ancient world was like much more aware of this phenomenon, and not just ancient history, but of course cross-culturally. And Charles brings some of that to bear too. What are we talking about? Should we be talking about this? I happen to think that this rediscovery has, I'll admit, I think it has a lot of dangerous aspects to it, psychologically, epistemologically dangerous aspects to it. But I do think it is part of a growing recognition that the model of the self that we inherited from the Reformation and the scientific revolution, the buffered monadic self-enclosed self, and that everything outside of it that isn't God is demonic or madness. That model of the self is breaking down both culturally and scientifically, and we're getting a much more dynamic, dialogical model of the self that's emerging and taking over the therapeutic world in powerfully important and effective ways. Many of you have probably seen some of the videos that I've done with Kazra or with Mark Lewis or with Seth Allison. And so Charles and I are going to dig into this really deeply. And I can't think of a better person. We've already recorded a couple of these. You're going to watch the first one right now, I hope. And I'm just really happy with how these are going. Charles and I are able to get into deep dialogos together. And I bring the cog-sci, he brings the history. It's kind of like what was going on in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Good cog-sci, I hope, and great history meet in a really deeply mutually transforming dialogos that helps people get, I think, a better framework for properly apprehending and appreciating this emerging phenomena, which I think is a proper part of the advent of the sacred today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. This is a new venture for me. This is going to be episode 1 of the first series on the new platform I'm running, the Lectern. And I'm really pleased to have somebody here who definitely belongs on the Lectern, a gifted teacher, author, a thinker, somebody that I've come to know quite well. And he's been on my channel before. And of course, I'm speaking about Charles Stang. So Charles, it's really wonderful to have you here. Maybe say a little bit about yourself, and then I'll sort of frame what we're going to be doing across these episodes, and then we'll start.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, John. It's wonderful to be here again. I echo everything you've said, and I would add that it's a delight to have come to call you a friend. So I'm looking forward to this latest chapter in our conversation. For those of you who are just joining, my name is Charles Stang, and I am a professor at Harvard Divinity School, and I am the director of something called the Center for the Study of World Religions here at Harvard, and have been for the past 6 years. And John and I have connected over the past 3 years through a series of symposia that brought us together and led us to realize just how much we have in common. So delighted to be here, John. Thank
you, Charles. So Charles and I were together at a symposium at Harvard, and I was talking to him about what we might do, and Charles made an excellent proposal. There's been, of course, some of you know, I've done a series of videos with people, psychologists or therapists from IFS or other people, or around encountering a daimon, an ally figure, some of the names that have been used, archetypal figure. And then I've been approaching that pretty much from sort of a psychotherapeutic and a cognitive science perspective. And we're not going to put those away, but Charles represents a perspective that really needs to be brought to bear on this, which is a historical, philosophical perspective, specifically, the long-standing reflection within the Platonic tradition on the daimon or the Daimonion. So that's what we thought we'd do. We thought we'd start with what's in Plato about this, and then work our way forward. Charles has a bunch of figures that he has in mind. I think Plutarch and Plotinus, and who's the other one? I can't remember.
Apuleius, right? And then beyond that, we'll see if there's still gas in the tank. But we'll try to cover those 4.
Yeah. I'm really open to this being open-ended and exploratory. And so I think I'll start by just sort of reminding people the context from my end, and then Charles, you can start to scaffold around it from the Platonic framework as you see fit. So I have been, the larger context is I have been taking up a bunch of practices in conjunction with the study of Theurgia, and Greg Shaw's work has been enormously helpful on that, and his new book on that, comparing Theurgia to Tantra, has been additionally helpful. And within that, I was doing things like Lectio Divina, etc., and other imaginal contemplative practices, rituals. And I was at the same time exploring IFS, both for personal therapeutic reasons and also because it struck me as a way of bridging between current psychotherapy, the Jungian corpus, and this idea of the imaginal at work within Theurgia. And while I was doing that, I was talking to various parts and having a sense of the self and all that stuff. And I've got a lot of IFS videos out there with a lot of people, so you can look at those. And Seth Allison actually did IFS on one of the videos, and we went through it together. He did it on me or with me. I don't know what the correct preposition is. But in one of these sessions, I had an experience in which a numinous figure interrupted, as if from off screen, came in and sort of pushed all the parts that I was working aside, not destructively, just, no, you're off stage right now. I'm center stage, and you're going to pay attention to me and talk with me. The figure, upon questioning, named himself as Hermes. And then I have since then had an ongoing dialogical practice with Hermes. Just did it today, for example. This has been challenging for me, not in the sense that I find it difficult. And that's not true either. I mean, because of my fundamentalist Christian upbringing, there's parts of me that still find this a very challenging thing to engage in. I'm also, very concerned and interested in, as a cognitive scientist, what's going on, and maintaining sort of intellectual philosophical integrity around this while being open to good argument and evidence, hopefully. But what's happened is many pivotal insights that have sort of been redirecting me as I'm going forward in the last couple of years have actually come out of dialogues with Hermes. So I just want to acknowledge that and be grateful to it. And just before, like literally 1 minute before I turn things over to Charles, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion around this pro and con, some of it quite extreme on both ends, a lot of it much more cautious and exploratory and open. And I think Charles is a good person to give us a sense of, there's been a deep heritage of reflection and practice, talking to each other about this, going back at least to Plato, probably further back, maybe Pythagoras, but clearly in Plato. And so that's why Charles is here. And that's Charles knows this story. I've told it to him in more detail in person. And he knows that I've been talking to people like Mark Lewis and Paul Vander Clay and Kazra Mirtai and Seth Allison and a whole bunch of people. But like I said, Charles can bring something that's really needed to this, the philosophical dimension.
Thanks, John. And I'm delighted to talk with you about this, as I was intrigued when you first mentioned it to me just this past May. But before I dive in, can I just ask, I imagine most people who are listening and following you know what IFS is, but for those who don't, what does the acronym stand for?
Sorry, thank you, Charles. It stands for Internal Family Systems Therapy. So it's a parts dialogical work, very, very powerful. And it's kind of there's earlier parts work. Jungian therapy often had parts work, Gestalt, the double chair, various therapies. In fact, one of the things that I noted in one of the videos is there's this growing convergence within the psychotherapeutic community towards dialogical practices, and an increasingly dialogical understanding of the self. I talked about this in, I think, episode 8 or 9 of After Socrates, and I talked about the Socratic shift, where I talked about this, my experience. I talked about Socrates' Daimon. I talked about the original sort of Platonic idea of the self as multiple and dialogical in nature, and how this is now gaining a lot of traction in the cognitive science of the self. So thank you for bringing that up, Charles. That was good. Yes.
Okay, thanks. And one last question, John, before I dive in again. When was your first encounter with this this persona that identified itself as Hermes?
It was during COVID. Christopher Mastropietro and I think you've met Chris at some point. I think maybe virtually. Anyways, he and I were doing, we were tag teaming on IFS. And this would happen to me when I was, we would alternate between doing it together, tag teaming, and alternating between us, and also doing it individually, like you're sort of supposed to do. It was sometime in 2021. I think late winter 2021, something like that.
Okay, great. So something that's been with you for years.
Very much so. Very much so, yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, John. And I will try to give some historical background to start, and then, we can decide where to dig deeper. And I'm going to follow your lead on that. What you think may be the most productive
Sure. Yeah.
parts of the Platonic account. So I'm going to start broad and then try to get more specific. So the broad backstory here is pre-Platonic, and I'm going to be very brief here. But the Greek word daimon, it can mean anything from a god. It can be used synonymously with theos. Euripides in the Bacchae has the god Dionysus and names himself a daimon, and other people refer to him as a daimon. So that word can mean the equivalent of theos or god. It can also mean, and comes increasingly to mean, divine beings that may not be as, so to speak, high or prominent as the Olympian gods, but powers, divinities, entities, spirits that inhabit the middle register between humans and the gods. And I say it comes to mean that, but one of the reasons it comes to mean that is because of Plato. So, in what is often said to be Plato's first dialogue, the Apology, we meet Socrates defending himself against his Athenian colleagues who have charged him with corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of Athens. And he tells us in his defense speech that he of course believes in the gods. He's no atheist, and he cites two pieces of evidence for that. One is that he is personally committed to the god Apollo, whose oracle at Delphi declared him the wisest of all Athenians. And secondly, and more germane to our topic today, he says, and I have since childhood had and then he uses various terms here, but the most consistent is daimonion, to daimonion. And that's a adjectival form of the word daimon. So it's often translated as divine or spiritual. And sometimes in Socrates' own mouth in the Apology, it stands on its own. So I've had a divine something with me since childhood. Sometimes it modifies a noun semeion, which means sign, a divine sign. Okay, so he tells them this, and we know that this is not just the invention of Plato, because Xenophon, another one of Plato's contemporaries, another devotee of Socrates, also talks about Socrates' daimonion. So at least within Socrates' own circle, it was known that he had this dialogical relationship. Although I should say, and this is maybe the most important thing to flag in the beginning, is that in the case of Socrates and his daimonion, it doesn't seem to be dialogical. And the two most significant features he names about this daimonion are that it only ever speaks, it never shows itself. So it is phonic rather than phanic. And that it only ever says no. It dissuades him from something. And he cites this not only because he's just telling his those who've alleged that he's an atheist or a godless. He cites that it only says no because he tells them, I know that I am on the right course here in this assembly because my daimonion is not saying no. And so even though he knows full well he's about to be condemned, he feels he has the implicit blessing or support of this divine sign.
So can I stop here and ask
Please.
some questions? So first, there are what I would call reductive interpretations of that. One is this is Socrates just poetically speaking about his conscience, and that's all that's being talked about here. I don't think that sits well with the text or how it operates, and the fact that Socrates can go into what seem to be profound trance states and other altered states of consciousness. These are reported as well. What do you say, though, to people who say this is just Socrates speaking about something we all have? We all have a voice in our head that says no. And to my understanding, that's not consistent with the way the phenomenology seems to be presented by Socrates. He seems to be talking about something that seems to be not just in his mind, and it seems to actually be something he hears. But I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Great question. Yeah. So this might be a place to introduce or the possible distinction in Plato between a daimon and then Socrates' daimonion.
Okay.
So this is tricky, and we can circle back around to it, but let's stay with the daimonion. I do not find compelling these reductive accounts that say this is simply Socrates' conscience, because the description Socrates gives, not only in the Apology, but in the handful of other places in the Platonic dialogues, as you said, the phenomenology is not just a moral compass, but the sense that there is another agent internal to Socrates, or somehow kind of impinging on him, guiding him, even if that guidance is just saying no. And I don't think that matches our account of what conscious is in modernity.
Yeah, for sure. And to your point, that sense of agency is why he thinks talking about this constitutes a defense against the accusation of atheism. If it was just his concept,
exactly.
Why would he think this constitutes a defense? No, he thinks of it as
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, he thinks of it as proof to them that no, I am talking about divine spiritual realities, and one in particular that is speaking to me. I think those accounts tell us more about our contemporary assumptions and comforts than they do about Socrates or the Athens of his day. So no, I don't find those particularly convincing. Socrates, I think it's in the Republic, I would have to confirm, also says that I believe he says he alone has the daimonion, which is a bit of a stumbling block, because in other places he says that every soul is assigned a daimon, so every soul has a daimon, and yet in another place he says I'm the only one who has this daimonion. And there are various ways to square that. One way to square it is to suggest that the fact that every one of us has a daimon is a kind of latent capacity.
Yeah, that's how I'd ran it too, because that certainly comes up in the later Neoplatonic interpretation, right?
Yes. So that's the other thing, is that I don't know if this is all, but to my knowledge, the Platonic tradition thinks that the daimonion is something we either all have or certainly can cultivate. So it's not some sort of unique feature of Socrates alone, but it's actually important for the project of philosophy. And so it has to be kind of available to everyone.
Right.
Even if it's slumbering.
So I interrupted because I thought that was a good place to ask that question, but you were going to say a bit more about that, or if not, I have some other questions to raise. And
why don't we go with your questions? Go ahead.
So, I mean, I'm doing a lot of work around what this might be from a cognitive scientific perspective. And so, for example, a couple of books. One is this work, Ben Alderson Day, on Presence, the Strange Science and True Stories of the Unseen Other. And so he's following up on the work of John Geiger, who wrote the semi-famous book, The Third Man Factor. about sense of presence. And just about what you were saying about Socrates, it only says no. Um, there seems to be this very, very extended continuum about the kind of experiences that people have around these presences. And for some, it's a completely silence. And for some of them, it's very odd. It's silent and there's nothing visual. It's just a felt presence. And then for some people, there's a sense of something that is speaking to them. I'm trying to be very neutral in my language here. And then there's a degree of how much speech happens as well. Sometimes it's very telegraphic. Sometimes it's more dialogical. There seems to be a very large spectrum of how people have these experiences. And of course, some of them seem to provide helpful guidance to people. John Geiger tells the famous story of the person ice climbing. And I don't know why people would ice climb. This sounds a totally bizarre thing to do. But as I would have thought was going to happen, the ice broke, he fell, and his companion fell. His companion died. He was hurt, and he was laying on the snow, and he was confronting the possibility of death. And then he had what he says, a felt presence came up to him and said, "Stand up, your nose is bleeding, so you can walk in the snow and you can leave a trail, and that way you won't walk in circles and you'll find your way out." And that's how he found his way out. And there are many accounts like this. But sometimes the daemon doesn't seem to be anything, or the presence, I should say, doesn't seem to be anything but some like a shadow figure that's just copying your motions. Like there seems to be a wide range, and they're having some initial success, sort of inducing this kind of stuff in people with various kinds of technological interventions. So I'm saying that because I wonder if what we might be seeing, so very weak hypothesis, but
okay,
because we see, I'm suggesting to you that we see something like this continuum as we look across the Platonic tradition from something like we get this weird thing, the report of somebody told there was a ritual in Plotinus's totalitarian,
yes,
and it doesn't seem like it talked or anything, but they just knew it was a god or something like, and so there's all this stuff. And I'm suggesting then rather that being sort of, and I know I'm on historical thin ice here, but rather than that being sort of just like, well, they were confused and the tradition is all over the place. Maybe this is actually representing a pretty robust feature of this phenomena, that it, like other cognitive things, it actually lies on a continuum from something very, very, like just basically some sort of projected, body image or mind image. That's a really cool idea that's emerging, that just like we have a body image, we might have a mind image and it can get projected outside of us to something that's this full archetypal dialogical presence. So I just wanted to suggest that to you and see what you thought about that as a possibility.
I mean, John, I fully agree. I think that the most plausible account is to suggest that Socrates' experience of the Daimonion is one experience among many of this phenomenon. So the tradition is both, I don't want to say beholden to his experience, but obviously his experience carries a particular authority.
Yeah.
And yet they still experiment with widening the phenomenology of the daimon. And I think that's important because I think, to me, that suggests that they too are not entirely convinced that Socrates' particular phenomenology is somehow normative of the reality.
Right.
And that there might be that other people might be able to hear this thing differently, or in fact even see it. So we can get to this in further episodes, but you already mentioned the episode named in Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, where an Egyptian priest manifests Plotinus's daimon in front of others. And Apuleius believes that the daimon can be seen if you cultivate your perception of air. So these are great theories of the daimon yet to be discovered. But in Plato, in any case, his description of Socrates has that fairly constrained phenomenology. But before I kick it back to you, I want to do a really wide, wide angle view and cite a book that I keep citing. A few years ago now, David Gordon White wrote a book called Demons Are Forever. Demons are forever. So obviously punning on diamonds are forever. And it's spelled Daemons. So that is the old transliteration of the Latin transliteration of the Greek, which preserves the original diphthong die in daimon, as opposed to what we, the English version of this demon is downstream of it. The obviously English demon it connotes not an intermediary being for most people, but an evil spirit, which is what happened when Christianity kind of had to confront what these beings were. They collapsed it into a demon. We can come back and talk more about that. I want to talk about David Gordon White's book Demons Are Forever, because he argues, and he's, for those of you who don't know his work, he's written a number of books on South Asia. He describes himself as a kind of Eurasianist historian of religion. His argument is that humans dealing with demons or daimons, is actually the substrate religion of Eurasia.
Oh,
that
interesting.
Is and that what we call the world religions are kind of like waves on this basic deep current, which is daimonology, which is why he says diamonds are forever. Basically, they've always been there. We've always talked to them. Sometimes traditions or religions are less amenable, less open to them. Witness Christianity, but that essentially that is what human religiosity is in the areas he's an expert in. And I thought that was a wonderfully provocative hypothesis, and also clearly then throws open the doors on the phenomenology.
Yeah.
If in fact this is in fact the deep layer, then of course we're going to see very different accounts of how and when people make contact with these beings.
I understand he's sort of doing this as Eurasian studies or whatever he called himself. But did he offer any, and I mean this not in the non-pejorative sense, did he offer any speculation, any theorization about the ontological status or nature of these?
I don't recall that he does. I think, I want to check this, but I believe he remains ontologically agnostic, as is so often the case.
Yeah, right. So I'm hoping you and I won't do that, or good, because I would like to keep pursuing this. So, I mean, this is part of a larger thing, and I know you're going to go back to this in a sec, but is it the Phaedo? I can't remember, where Socrates has a dream and he's going to compose music, and so Socrates is very much. He's not the Cartesian rationalist, the analytic tradition. Sometimes that's how I was brought up in my undergrad, to see Socrates, right? The paragon of rationalness, but no, he seems to think, but he seems to be able to go in a trance state or some kind of deep mindfulness state for 24 hours, 48 hours, different records on this. He seems to be impressed by dreams in a very interesting way. He's very interested in mania and I mean that in the Greek sense, not in our current sense. So I'm just trying to, I just also for the benefit of the viewers, this isn't just sort of an isolated, aberration in him, in his sort of stance. It's part of a whole family of things that he's involved in. So I just wanted to also put that on the table for us to bring into the discussion.
Absolutely. And so I too was, well, is this fair? No, I think I was saved being introduced to Plato as if he were a kind of poor analytic philosopher.
Right.
I remember a story Hilary Putnam told us in class when I don't know, I was an undergraduate, maybe I was a sophomore, and he said that when he first taught out of graduate school, he had to teach Plato, and he'd never studied ancient philosophy. And so he, like many others, introduced Plato by excerpting arguments, formalizing them, and being baffled as to why this figure was esteemed so highly in history of philosophy, because his arguments are often spurious. But he was confessing that late in his career to say this is clearly a naive view of Plato and a terrible way to approach ancient philosophy. But I think it was the norm.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and so I don't think I didn't have to go through that gauntlet, but I heard of it, and I just want to fully endorse what you said. Plato has, first of all, Plato, as you know very well, John, and your listeners may as well, incredibly sophisticated literary artist.
Yeah.
So we have to contend with, like, this is a highly complicated literary orchestration, these dialogues, not just a single one, but how they all work together. And then these, as you said, his whatever this relationship is to the Daimonion is part of a constellation of things that is simply incompatible with Socrates being a pure rationalist is, or a kind of reductive rationalist in the way that I think some people would prefer to see him.
Thank you for watching. This YouTube and podcast series is by the Vervaeke Foundation, which, in addition to supporting my work, also offers courses, practices, workshops, and other projects dedicated to responding to the meaning crisis. If you would like to support this work, please consider joining our Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes. So for me, this, in addition to, I'll call it my theurgic experience, for lack of I don't think we have a modern term that fits it well. So that's why I'm going to use that term. To call it psychological is inadequate to my mind, to my ear. But anyways, in addition to that, I've been engaged in this longer project of trying to rehabilitate rationality, or at least reasonableness, and take it out of the purely propositional, right, the purely logical, and open it back up. And so this also brings up, a lot of people who are working on this topic, or at least that constellation. I've noticed a shift in tone in a lot of the scholarship. Initially, there was a tone around, this was kind of weirdness or some sort of irrationality in Socrates. And then there was a more neutral tone. And now there seems to be a more positive tone saying, no, we think there's a contradiction between these and what we believe rationality is, and what we should, if we pay attention to the text, that's not what we seem to be getting. We seem to get something that does sound like a dichotomy to us. It's like, Socrates gives the sign authority, but yet he also always has an argument or a justification for why he's doing what he's doing. And, post Kant, we sort of think it's one or the other. It's authority or argument. And how could they sit? So like they don't belong together. Aren't they opponents? Wasn't the Enlightenment about argument replacing authority? Like, what's going on here? And you're nodding and smiling. So you got a flavor for this already. So, But what do you think about that? Are you getting the same read? I'm sort of sensing a drift. I don't mean that in any pejorative sense, where the scholarship is saying maybe we got to step back and stop bringing our Enlightenment presuppositions to bear on this and think how could we get to a place where we see these two interpenetrating rather than oppositional. Does that track for you at all? Is that
Yeah, that resonates very deeply, and I think I see it not only in scholarship, but I think in popular discourse, popular culture. I think that there is a sense that whatever we take pure reason to be, and I know that that's always a construction, that there's a desire for a broader account of rationality. And there's various ways of broadening rationality. And some of those you may not agree with. I don't exactly have like a staked out view on this, but to think about other forms of reasoning than a logically airtight argument as a form of rationality. But also again, people will think about, sometimes we'll talk about like storytelling as a form of rationality. And again, you may not find all of these equally compelling, but I do feel like, and I don't know whether this is just in philosophical circles where it does feel to me like a certain kind of analytic philosophical path has run its course.
Yeah.
There's a kind of exhaustion with it. And so there's a desire to either back up and look at the tradition before it went down this particular path, and also look to adjacent fields and how they're thinking about rationality. And so that in that case, I have often found philosophy to be, well, it's kind of, it's fair. Philosophy at times doesn't play well with other disciplines, but when it does play well with other disciplines, it tends to be disciplines that you know well. It tries to play well with cognitive science and neuroscience, obviously with mathematics and logic and other idioms. But do you feel like philosophy and these other kind of disciplines that you're trained up in are actually productively in dialogue around this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so a couple things. The part of philosophy that comes through Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Dreyfus is like Husserl, huge impact. My friend and colleague Evan Thompson, huge impact on 4E cog sci. And this notion of cognition being transjective, which I think will probably come back at some point in our discussion, because I think that's, for me, that's the best adjective I have for the phenomenology of Hermes. But the idea that cognition is fundamentally transjective, between metaxu, to use a Platonic term. I'm probably mispronouncing it. I apologize. But that, and then some of the work that I've done with people and like Dan Chappie and others, and Chris, around the different kinds of knowing, the procedural, the perspectival, the participatory, and how there are forms of rationality. Even our notion of reasonable isn't so much about a person making an argument, is about a person paying attention in the right way to the right things and participating with the right agentic role and the right sense of responsibility for a situation. That's what that's the standard that is used, for example, in common law, when we say, no, you were negligent. You didn't do anything, but you should have done this, because that's what the reasonable person would do. And I'm doing enough Hegel to know that's not just sort of an easy natural kind. All I'm trying to say is it doesn't land just squarely on sort of propositional inferential competence. And what 4E Cog Sci has been emphasizing is that the propositional is ultimately dependent on these non-propositional forms of knowing. And there's a big current in, people like Gonzalez and Highland, people I know well, who emphasize the non-propositional. And the fact that the Greeks have multiple terms for knowing, I think, is also something we should pay attention to. So all of that. And then out of this, and especially some of the work I've been doing, just got a major paper published in Frontiers on the relevance realization theory, and how it can't be computational, by the way, which goes to the point that I'm making right now. But the notion of the imaginal and how it has an indispensable role in even what we might prototypically consider rationality. If you're giving me a sec, I think you've heard me make this argument, but I don't know if I've made it here. One of the things that seems to be a requirement for rationality is a metacognitive ability to step back and reflect, and know, become aware of your cognition so that you can redirect it. In fact, that seems to be an essential feature. If you don't have that, if your attention and intelligence couldn't ever do this reflective thing, then it's hard to know how you could ever be rational in the way we seem to indicate, like noticing bias or noticing fallacy or noticing misdirection, etc. And so this makes use of this thing called working memory, which overlaps with consciousness and attention. I'm not going to get into that very juicy and wonderful mix. But the point is, and everybody has this. And when I ask you to do, without using paper or pen, you have to do it in your head, 22 times 37, and you go into this space and you start doing this sort of visual stuff and sort of manipulating things around. And then you give me the answer. The answer is correct. Or if you're mistaken, I say, I think this wrong. You can go back and go, oh, that's what I did wrong. And I'm confident that nobody finds anything I'm saying bizarre in any fashion. And this would be central. Now, here's the thing. Is that space literally a physical space? No, that's ridiculous. Is it merely a fiction in the pejorative sense of the word? No, because it gives you some kind of awareness and knowledge of your cognitive processes such that you can correct yourself and become more rational in your processing. So it's neither fictional nor is it literal. So, and this goes in with predictive processing models, etc. And this is where Corbin's notion of the imaginal comes in. It's imaginal. And it's like, oh, well, wait, my capacity for rationality is dependent on the imaginal in a deep way. And then you say, and couldn't it not be that in, the Platonic tradition, they're doing theurgic practices to strengthen, I'm doing this because we'll maybe talk about what that might mean, but, somehow educate the imaginal, and that could actually improve my ability to have metacognitive awareness, knowledge, and self-direction. And that's the kind of thing that I think cognitive science is speaking to answer. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
Oh, no, it's great, though.
Yeah.
Oh, that was great. So I've been thinking, since we started this conversation, of course, of when to invoke Corbin, because you have used the word imaginal a number of times. You and I have talked about this many times. I never tire of Corbin, but I want to invoke him in a specific way,
sure,
if I might, which is to say, there's three things I want to just flag that we can talk through today, but also signposts for where we might go in the future. So I'll return to Corbin in a moment, but first, your interest that we are open to the ontological.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that. Another is the fact that in your phenomenology of the daimon, you have the specificity of Hermes.
Yes.
And that has its own very curious lineage, which intersects with Platonism, and we may want to talk about.
I do. I want to talk about that.
But let me just I'll take your invitation with Corbin that will invoke both the ontological and the Hermetic, which is to say, Corbin was interested in this. You could say he, not unlike David Gordon White, he had a theory, a hypothesis he built out over the whole course of his career that these kinds of encounters with the daimon are signs of a much broader, in fact, universal feature of reality for humans.
Yeah.
So, and that in fact, what you learn through encounters with the daimon actually teach you the nature of reality all the way up to, but just short of, the one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he kind of embedded this in an extremely ambitious metaphysics that owed a lot to Platonism and esoteric Islam. So like Corbin to me is a really interesting dialogue partner because, like David Gordon White, has a theory about how this is operating writ large, but unlike David Gordon White, as I recall, I'm certain Corbin is not an ontological agnostic.
Yeah, no, he
thinks this is in
exactly.
fact the case.
Well said.
Yeah. So in Corbin's case, what is interesting is, and I'm still teasing this out as I'm writing this piece on Corbin, but he thinks that these encounters with these personae or agents that we sense are not entirely us, but are somehow maybe uniquely attached to us, are that he says that the broader theory to account for this is not actually daimonology, but angelology. And he goes to Proclean angelology to try to give an account of this. And his hypothesis is that might be stronger than hypothesis. I think he thinks it's a certainty, is that these daimonic or angelic encounters are your encounter with your higher self.
Yes.
Essentially initiating you into the next stage of your elevation and integration. So I'm going to paraphrase this, but he says the name angel, I believe he says this, I can't remember exactly where. Angel is the name we give to the kind of ecstatic encounter of ourself and its double as it's leveling up. And that is like a chain or a ladder. So there's a kind of angelic hierarchy, or another way he puts it is we activate the angelic function of our being. For him, you could say activating the daimonic function of our being, and it would be the same way. So that the daimonic is actually is constitutive of our metaphysics, and it marks what you might call up-leveling or leveling up. And of course, for him, the Hermetic tradition is the thing that really understood this. And so when you told me that this figure identified itself as Hermes, I thought, oh God, all right, is this just because you've been reading too much Corbin? Or well, this is a fascinating question. Let's just raise that as a question. If your daimon has introduced itself, and I believe you used him, suggesting that I want to raise that question too. Did this entity's gender match yours? Did you have a strong sense of its gender? Maybe we just raise that question for a minute.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'll address the question, then I want to come back and and we both know Thomas Cheetham and I, because I got from him the idea that for Corbin, in a Neoplatonic kind of framework, there, it's not just humans that have an angel. There's everything is participating in a more divine reality in some important way. So it's not even a species specific, if I can sound scientific, species specific phenomena. Now back to your question. So, and this has been something that's very recently, even like today. Initially, so for me, talking doesn't work. It doesn't catch. And I only have middling sort of mental imagery, visual imagery. I'm not young. And this is one of the advantages that IFS has over some Jungian practices, because Jung's practices tend to sort of default to inner mental visualization. And we now know there's that's a Gaussian distribution with a nice fat tail of people, right, who don't have very good imagery. So things like active imagination don't do very much for them. But IFS, and I want to give credit to Schwartz, because he seems to, I think, I might be misremembering, but I think he actually says this was his phenomena. So he started writing, and that works for me. I write dialogically. Like I'll put H for Hermes and then I put J for John and I write. But what's been happening, to your point, is in addition to writing what Hermes says, and Hermes has asked me to keep extending this, I also do descriptors, like almost like stage in parentheses, like he's laughing right now, or he's like like stage direction descriptions almost. And it's because of that. And that was almost from the beginning that I started doing that, and that has grown and become prominent. And I also had, so I hope this doesn't, well, I had one visionary experience of Hermes very early on that reinforced me to take this practice up. So I was not just in the practice, and I was not just sort of doing this, inner outer dialogue kind of thing. I was in my bed and I looked over there, and there was a figure, kind of like, and Thomas would love this, kind of like an amalgamation of the Greek Hermes and the Christian Michael, bronze, armored, and glowing, and visionary, and clearly, and I'm not making any, I hope, any sexist claim to it, clearly male to me. And so that's the answer to your question. That's how I've only had one of those experiences. It's never repeated. It was at the very beginning. It was very powerful. It was scary. It was not in, I was stone cold sober, as people like to say, right? There was nothing, I was not in any kind of debilitated cognitive state. And it came upon me. Boy, I find it difficult to talk this way. It came upon me, and it was very powerful, very clear. It glowed, very numinous, and the point of it seemed to be to encourage me to go beyond that initial encounter and commit to a regular practice. And since I've committed to that practice, that it has become much more grounded in the voice and sense presence, and I only get sort of this weird, like I say, stage direction imagery now. But how can I say it? Hermes seems more alive to me in this form than in the visionary form, even though the visionary form would be prototypically something most people will regard as, like, it was numinous. It was shining, it was glowing. It was on the edge of very scary, but yet also beautiful and fascinating. The Otto stuff was just archetypally there, kind of thing.
Mm. Oh, that's so interesting, John. So I don't know that you, I don't know that you, I'm curious if you've ever met Tanya Luhrmann. There she, okay, right. So
that's the other book. That was the other book I was going to mention, and her third way in which things are real, which overlaps with I think it's converging with the argument I've been making for transjectivity in a very powerful way. But so the answer, I haven't met her, but I've studied her work.
You know her work, right? I figured you might, given that she's interested in people who hear and see things.
Yeah.
One of the things that the first time I met Tanya, she told a story at which she has subsequently told in public. So I feel free to share it. That when she was doing her, I think it was fieldwork on her second book, where she was working with pagans in Britain, she took on all their practices, and because it's a tradition that understands its lineage as having suffered, interruption. So the practices are very hard to reconstruct and attenuated, to say the least. Their practices are significantly focused around the imagination.
Right.
They don't know how to do they don't know what to do and what the rituals were and what. So they have these imaginative exercises. And she describes how she, took these practices on in order to be a member of the community. And then waking up one morning, I have the details right, she woke up in bed and there were 3 druids at the bottom of her bed.
Yeah.
Or 3, what appeared to her to be druids. And now Tanya, I think, is ontologically open, but still, in some ways a skeptic. And her account of this is what can happen phenomenologically when you train imagination. Imagination can produce things that are real phenomenologically. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, and I mean, in one sense, that's surprising, but it's another. I mean, I do work on the cognitive science of dreaming and lucid dreaming, and I've done some lucid dreaming practice, and and Thole and other people have worked with lucid dreamers, and they encounter figures, and they're lucid, so they have self awareness in the dream, but they encounter figures that seem to have knowledge and perspective that they don't have any direct access to, strike them as very real, and again, it seemed what I'm saying is there seems to be a functionality at work here, and not just a phenomenology. There seems to be something going, like the brain is investing tremendous amounts of energy and time and putting you in a very dangerous state, presumably for something that has adaptive benefits. I do think there's an emerging cognitive scientific theory of what's going on in dreaming, but I don't need that theory to be specifically explicated or true for the point I'm making. It's like, well, of course, I haven't read the paper. I just read the abstract. When people mind wander, the default mode network, apparently, if you go into second person with that, you get beneficial effects out of mind wandering that you don't get if you go first person or third person when you're mind wandering. Like this is what I mean. There's all this stuff, and I don't want to sound psychotic or anything, but there's all these things that there's, to my mind, they are converging towards each other. They're trying to talk to each other. They're trying to get us aware of, well, wait a sec. Like, what is that? Is it that weird to encounter figures that seem to be in us and out us and have alternative? I mean, we do, and every night to some degree, and you can people. Jung seems to have been right. I don't know if there's been any deep the rigorous work on this, but I've talked to everybody I've talked to about this who does any dream journaling. There's differences between these everyday dreams and then these big dreams in which you meet these kinds of personages in your dream. And then of course the work that, so what I'm saying is it doesn't surprise me that if Lerman was taking up these practices, that she would have this kind of experience. In fact, I'm going to be a little bit provocative. It's kind of odd that we should be surprised about this. Like, what is it about us, given what we've been talking about what Gordon White is proposing, and the fact that she's getting these, and she has similar. I don't know if she gets an experience, but she reports similar experiences when she's working with the Christians, right? And the presencing of Jesus, and I don't mean any disrespect here. I'm not saying Jesus ontologically is a daimon, but I mean, people have these experiences too of something that seems to be in them and out them, beyond them. And so I'm just wondering about how you would square all of that with what I think is an excellent point you brought up from Corbin. And you and I have talked about this. And of course, you wrote your wonderful book, The Divine Double, around this idea that the daimon or the angel is in some sense our aspirational self, our divine self, our future self, maybe not temporally future, but ontologically future, if I could play with that metaphor. Like, and I know, I mean, that's definitely the case for, so I've been, Raf's work, the guy who did ally work, the person whose work I took up to do this practice with Hermes. He's seen Sophia. He's had dialogues with Sophia. But see, the things like the Druids, maybe we're back to this continuum thing again. Like, because
I think so.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if there's a general function of sort of, like you said, there's some kind of access to a reflection from our better self. This language is so useless, but it can vary from being like really profound and insightful to being. Hers sounds sort of middling to me. There's Druids there, and okay, what do you do with that? And then to, like I say, to people who just like there's people who report, I have a presence behind my left shoulder. It's been there my whole life. Do you talk to it? No. Does it do anything? No, it's just there. Stuff like that.
Yep. Okay, great. So one of the things I have been wrestling with, and I don't have an answer to it yet by any means. So this is just, I'm exploring this both.
Well, we're exploring together.
As
friends.
Yeah, and we're exploring this stuff. I think I get the sense from you that we're exploring this as scholars and as interested parties.
Yeah.
We have some existential skin in this game, and you've been very open about that today. So the question I have that you've raised is, okay, we have daimon encounters. Some daimon encounters seem to suggest that the daimon is like somehow part of or uniquely or individuated to you. You're encountering something that's somehow you and somehow not you. And this is, I think, what Corban leans into, the idea that something about the destiny of yourself is wrapped up in these encounters. But now to tack back to someone like David Gordon White, there's also a lot of daimonic encounters where the being, entity, persona you encounter, you feel to be significantly other and importantly other, that you don't want to just collapse it into just being an aspect of you. So theorists want to know, okay, well, what does this mean? Is it, is the daimon you experience as importantly other? Is that still just you, but for whatever reason you need to experience it as other? Or, I wonder, both kind of ontologically and phenomenologically open, well, maybe the daimonic realm has entities that are individuated to me and some that aren't.
Yeah.
And I might encounter either or both. And in fact, I see the Platonic tradition, when we get to Apuleius, I know this is the case, trying to wrestle with this very thing.
Yeah.
How is it that I might have a daimon, but there's daimons out there that aren't me, that aren't mine? Why is that? So what's the kind of ecology of personhood that we're living in?
That's excellent. Paul Vanderklay asked me a very good question, and it really, and this is why I was hesitant when I was talking about Lerman's work. You see, you get, and I grew up with this. So for me, he said, what would happen if you met somebody else who has a Hermes? And I said, that's a good question. I don't know. I would hope that we could get into some, dialogos between all four of us in some fashion, and something would emerge out of that. And I want to talk a little bit about that too, that when Hermes and I are in thing, it's very much like when I'm doing dialogos with others, you get the logos emerging, something that's evolved, co-generated. But to Lerman, and Jesus is supposed to be shared by everybody, right? In a way that the ally or the like, which in Raf's work, it's very much identified to you, and this is how I'm experiencing it. But you see, even in that official story, I grew up, and and it's subversive, but people would talk about how Jesus spoke to them, and even as a kid, you notice the same Jesus is saying different things to different people about the same problem or about the same goal in the church. And it's like, Jesus spoke to me and we should do this. And well, Jesus spoke to me and said we shouldn't do that. And it's like, and I'm saying that I don't think this problem is distinct to the Platonic tradition. I think there's something we're bumping up against here, which is, this is not the whole thing. I want to state that right away. But I think part of it is we're really wrestling with, as Lerman is pointing out, and as I've argued, we've got this third sense of real that hangs, but that is other than the subjective and the objective. And then we also have this other thing that isn't the same thing as the transjective, but it's the intersubjective. And so we're playing with these four things, to my mind. We've got sort of, and you and I both know all of these are philosophically contested, and since Descartes onward. But just to lay it out, we've got a notion of the objective, we've got a notion of the subjective, sort of I think back with Plato and Metaxu, and definitely with Heidegger, and we've definitely got, and for ecog we have the transjective, and then and I'm thinking here of Hegel, we have the intersubjective and the terrific role it plays in generating our normativity, and we don't have. This sounds like we don't have a meta-normativity that tells us how to organize and order these four.
It's a great way to put it. Mm-hmm.
Right. I think the Heideggerian arguments about aletheia being more primordial than coherence and correspondence, right? And then therefore it has a kind of priority. And I think this jives with the non-propositional being more important. Like there's an asymmetric dependent of the propositional on the non-propositional. I think I'm okay with that. But when I step back and I'm looking at these things, and I'm trying to do sort of the Nishida thing of where am I standing, where I'm trying to ask this question about what's the relationship between the subjective, the objective, the intersubjective, and the transjective. And yeah.
Well, okay. So when I hear you lay out those four, I think I would love to see you write on this question. In Corbin's version of Platonism, there is the realm of sense perception, which we largely operate. There is the realm of intellect,
the intelligibles,
and between the intelligibles, and there is the realm of the imaginal. Now, unlike other Platonists, Corbin is actually not terrifically interested in the realm of the intelligibles because he feels like we're not ready for that. We're like deal with the proximate realm, and the proximate realm is the imaginal. Okay, so so he's very interested in the in between sense perception and the intellect, and this is the realm he's spent his career trying to account for. So that's a tripartite model. Then you've got a different model, subjective, objective, transjective, and intersubjective. How would you begin to lay those two on top of one another, or is it even productive to try to do so? No. And of course, the daimon is somewhere in the middle.
Well, yeah. So I'm going to complexify it and maybe problematize it a bit, because I think about this a lot, and it's been coming out in some of the online courses. I think because Corbin, and I think Thomas does a good job laying out the imaginal, although he doesn't seem to foreground this as much. The imaginal is also in between the inner and the outer in a really important way. The world turned inside out, as Thomas says, right? And so I like to emphasize that because it helps me say this is where I think when people talk about the subjective and objective, they use a horizontal line. They talk about inner and outer, and they gesture this way and that way. Same thing with the intersubjective. Because we have the metaphor of peers are the people who are on the same platform as I am. And so we point horizontally, right? And of course, the transjective, as it's almost always talked about, like the affordances in Gibson, are always drawn on paper with horizontal lines. It's the horizontal, right? And by the way, all of this is imaginal because it's not literally horizontal in any fashion whatsoever. But we just do this like, oh yeah, of course, right? And I think that other dimension you're pointing to, which is the one I think we are trying to properly recover. And this is a lot of the work I'm doing with Greg Enriquez and other people about what I call, transcendent naturalism, extended naturalism, is the recovery of the vertical, which you just laid out, where and you did the vertical with your hands, right? You went, here's the sensible, and there was a sort of vague, and then in between is the imaginal, and up here in some indeterminate way are the intelligibles. And it's, to my mind, it's like, yeah, I want to know, because I think Plato was wrestling with the vertical, and then we have, Descartes wrestling with the horizontal. I want to know about how to put those two dimensions of our judgments about the nature of reality, if you'll allow me to just, use the horizontal and the vertical. And we have this one where we're sort of laying out like we're trying to articulate some kind of relationality this way, and the other is we're trying to indicate some kind of relationality that way. And what's difficult to my mind, in the Neoplatonic tradition, it's encouraging, but it's also difficult, is participation is used for both dimensions, both ways. The conformity theory, I'm participating in the object and I are sharing the same form, but of course there's also implicit in that, until sort of you get into early modernity. Well, that's because they're both participating also upward in the same form, and you get that sort of triangle model that people often draw, right? And so I think talking about these two dimensions to the ontology has a lot of provenance in it, and I think it also connects up with our phenomenology and our experience of the imaginal being both this way and this way. Look at what I did with you, that space. You go inside your head, but you go metacognitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's all there. And the thing about our phenomenology is this seems to run very smoothly for us. And yet when we try to articulate it conceptually, well, you get like your question, right? Was how do they sit together? And is there anything deeper than the metaphors? And then to your point, is the Daimon sits on both of those dimensions for me. I mean, not just theoretically. I mean, when I'm encountering Hermes, I feel like I am with you, very much horizontal, but I also feel like you were saying the Corban stuff. I also feel like I'm relating to my divine double that is somehow beyond me and above me, but I sometimes call him the brother that is the other that in me, in my self-transcendence, right? How you overcome, Strawson's paradox of self-transcendence. It has to be you and not you. And Hermes is basically that come to life personified. So there's definitely the transcendent dimension, and there's both at the same time. Sorry, Charles, that's a long answer, but your question is it's a very pressing one.
Yeah. John, do you have any to apologize for going on along? I love hearing you talk. So, but speaking of length, I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time, and you may have concluding thoughts. I simply wanted to raise again some issues that I think to name some issues we've raised and suggest that we can return to them.
Let's do that. I'm going to note these down too. Go ahead, please.
Okay, great. Well, just your last comment about how we use the horizontal and the vertical. That was those two axes were one of the ways I tried to structure the book around the divine double, and both the necessity of them and the inadequacy of them. So that's one thing I'd like to just flag. I think we've named and can explore more the question of whether and how the daimon is and is not us.
Yeah.
Does that mean there's different kinds of daimons, or is it just different experiences of the very same daimon?
And then could I bounce off that and also that our notion of us, maybe we're not monadic substances. I think that.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah, I think I think that's part of it too. Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, we are each plural. There's the question about, in the phenomenology of a daimon, how much of that phenomenology is culturally or tradition specific, culturally mediated, tradition specific. And Corban was also thinking about that, and was fairly open about that. So, just, I think, softening, you don't have a whiff of this, but sometimes people who have visionary encounters are quite attached to the literal image of the vision, and just thinking about how a visionary encounter also needs to be interpreted, not decoded, but understood as something co-created by your own very specific historical embodied person and whatever reality you're encountering.
So I would bounce off that one and say, Yeah, for me, cognition is 4E. It's embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And that was always, and I didn't get a whiff from you either. That was always my standpoint where I'm coming from. I don't think of this as fitting into, spatial temporal object ontology.
Right.
It's no. These are the realities that emerge between us and our world. And I don't just mean our biological spatial world, I also mean our cultural historical world. And so, yes, that is, very much. But my point would be that's not a property that's unique to the daemon. I think that is a general feature of cognition per se.
See, that's great, because that's making our presumed this alleged consensual reality that we regard as something we just happen across. You're saying actually that is just as much co-created as these visionary experiences.
And I think that consensual experience, it has, and I was trying to show it to you with gesture and conceptual metaphor, it dwells in the imaginal as well. In a very powerful way. Like what people talk about, they talk about the social space and the we space and the consensual reality as where's that ontologically located? And so, I exactly. I think that's exactly right. So yeah, I'm just going to put cultural and 4E sort of as a note.
Yeah. It's like you're saying, it's like 4E visionary experience. I like that, right?
Yeah. So
visionary. Go ahead.
Do you think we sort of covered what you wanted to talk about with Socrates?
I think so. What I'm going to suggest is this. My inclination is that we move on chronologically to Plutarch.
Right.
I think he's the next significant stop along this, next significant station on this line. But I'll also go back through Plato and see if there's any loose ends that I want to bring up again. And so we might have a follow-up Plato. I mean, all of these people will bring us back to Plato because, of course, they're reading Plato. But my inclination is to press on to Plutarch.
Okay. Let's do that. So I always like to give my interlocutor the last word, and I'm going to carry that tradition on into the lectern. And so thank you, by the way, for being inaugural of that. But any last things you want to say before I turn off the recording?
Only that I think that the question of the daimon, while it may appear to many as an obscure esoteric topic, is actually a crucial philosophical and metaphysical issue and urgent. And I hope to be able to explain by the end of our conversation why I think it is an urgent matter. But this is not, in my view, tarrying with some sort of obscure, fruitless, bizarre experience. I think this is actually extremely bedrock.
Okay, I'm going to break my rule and comment on that, because I want to say something about that, which is I've been slowly posing the possibility that this is a bedrock function in us, and it's not some aberration or pathology in our cognition. And I've been sort of trying to make that case gradually with you, carefully, I hope. And I think that's because, unbeknownst to us, that function is already being tapped and will be tapped even more by the virtual and the AGI. And if we do not come into a proper Socratic self-awareness of this functionality within us, I think these emerging technologies that also can inhabit this weird imaginal transjective space in a very, very super salient way, if we do not properly access our capacity and educate it so that it works in our best interest, I think it has the very real possibility of being hijacked and manipulated by people who are not acting in our best self-interest. So I'm also concerned about how it's not only bedrock, but I think it's cutting edge in terms of certain issues and problems we're facing right now.
Fantastic. Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, John. I'll be in touch, and we'll find time for the next iteration of this.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching this video. We're going to continue the practice of releasing free videos like this on YouTube a little less frequently. I'm trying to rein in how thinly I have been spreading myself. I need to do this. Maybe some of you have seen the reasons that I've made public on videos released on behalf of the transition to the Lectern format. Many of you would like to follow up this in more detail and depth. You will find links to those following videos that are for patrons only, and the links to that will be found in the notes to this video. Thank you very much. Take good care.